The rain that night didn't wash the blood away. It just made it shine under the street lamps of 116th Street. There was no thunder. The only sound that mattered had already happened. 9 cracks. Sharp, deliberate, rhythmically spaced, like a carpenter driving nails into a coffin that had been measured weeks ago. The man on the pavement wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. The steam rising from the sewer grates swirled around him like a ghost trying to decide if it should leave or stay to watch the fallout. A cigarette dropped from a trembling hand nearby hissed as it hit a puddle. No one screamed. That's the thing about Harlem when the real heavyweights make a move. The civilians don't scream, they vanish. Windows closed, shades were pulled down. The street cleared so fast as if the pavement itself was radioactive. The man lying there wasn't just a body. He was a piece of architecture. He was a pillar. You knock down a pillar, the roof comes down. Or the man holding up the rest of the building decides to burn the whole city to the ground. 9 shots. They didn't shoot him to kill him. 1 shot kills a man. 2 makes sure. 9 is a conversation. 9 is a manifesto written in lead and gunpowder. It was a message sent to one specific address, to one specific man who was sitting 3 blocks away, staring at a chessboard, waiting for a phone call he knew was coming, but hoping he was wrong. The silence that followed those shots was heavier than the noise. It wasn't empty silence. It was the sound of a fuse burning down. The air felt thick, pressurized, like the moment before a dam breaks. Everyone knew who was lying on the ground, but more importantly, everyone knew who was not lying on the ground, and that terrified them more. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. What the history books will tell you is that it was a gang war. They'll call it a territorial dispute, a casualty of the numbers racket, a statistic in a police file that gathered dust in a basement downtown. They are lying to you. Not because they want to deceive you, but because they didn't understand the language these men spoke. The police report says the victim was shot at 11:04 p.m. It lists the caliber of the weapon. It lists the entry wounds, but it leaves out the most important part. It leaves out the fact that for the next 48 hours, the most vibrant, noisy, chaotic square mile in America went completely, terrifyingly silent. There were no files on what Bumpy Johnson felt that night. The FBI wiretaps caught nothing but static. The informants, men who would sell their own mothers for a plea deal, suddenly forgot how to speak English. Because they knew something the authorities didn't. They knew that the man lying on the wet asphalt wasn't just a lieutenant. He was the only tether keeping a monster in a suit from tearing the world apart. And someone had just cut the rope. Before you understand the violence, you have to understand the love. In a world built on transactions, on what have you done for me lately, loyalty is a liability. It makes you slow, it makes you predictable. But for Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, loyalty wasn't a transaction, it was the foundation. He wasn't a man who trusted easily. To get close to Bumpy was to walk through a minefield blindfolded. But this man, this friend, He was the one who knew where the mines were buried because he helped plant them. He was the one who could look Bumpy in the eye and say no when everyone else was nodding yes out of fear. They shared cold nights in cells when the heat was off. They shared bread when there was no money. They shared secrets that could topple judges and ruin politicians. This wasn't just a business partner. This was the mirror Bumpy looked into to remind himself he was still human. Imagine the isolation of a king. The higher you climb, the colder it gets. The air gets thin. You stop seeing faces and start seeing angles. You stop hearing voices and start hearing motives. But this friend was the anchor. He was the reminder of the street corner, of the days before the suits, before the legend. He was the only person on earth who called Bumpy by his first name and meant it. And now he was cooling on the pavement, 9 holes in his chest. The news didn't travel by phone, it traveled by vibration. You could feel it in the floorboards of the jazz clubs. You could taste it in the smoke at the Lenox Lounge. The music didn't stop, but the rhythm changed. The laughter died out, replaced by whispers that sounded like prayers. They got him. They really did it. Does Bumpy know? That was the question. Does Bumpy know? He was in the back room of a storefront on 125th. The room was dim, smelling of stale coffee and old wood. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't throwing furniture. When the runner burst in, breathless, eyes wide with the horror of what he'd seen, Bumpy didn't stand up. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He just looked at the chess piece in his hand. A pawn, a dispensable piece. But this friend wasn't a pawn. He was a knight. He could jump over obstacles. He moved in ways others couldn't. Bumpy set the piece down. The click of the wood on the board sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stood up. He adjusted his tie. He put on his coat. "Go home," he told the runner. "Go home and lock your door." "What are we going to do, Bumpy?" the kid asked, his voice cracking. Bumpy stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. The silhouette of his fedora cut a sharp line against the frosted glass. "We aren't doing anything," Bumpy said. His voice was so low it felt like it was coming from inside the walls. "This is where the legend shifts. This is where the man becomes the myth." Any other gangster would have sent cars out immediately. Tires screeching, Tommy guns rattling, breaking windows, burning businesses. That's what the Italians would have done. That's what the Irish would have done. Noise, fury, retaliation. Bumpy Johnson did nothing. For hour 1, the streets waited for the explosion. For hour 2, the police mobilized riot squads, expecting a bloodbath. For hour 12, the rival factions, the ones who ordered the hit, sat in their social clubs, sweating, guns on the table, waiting for the doors to be kicked in. But the kick never came. The sun came up over Harlem, and it was quiet. The shops opened, but the owners spoke in hushed tones. The numbers runners did their rounds, but they didn't smile. Bumpy was seen walking, just walking. He walked past the spot where his friend died. The blood had been washed away by the city, but Bumpy stopped. He looked at the ground. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He stood there for a full minute, a statue in cashmere coat, while the city moved around him. People saw him and crossed the street. Not out of disrespect, but out of a primal instinct to get out of the blast radius. They saw something in his face that was worse than anger. They saw calculation. Anger burns out. Fury is a fire. It consumes fuel, and then it dies. Calculation is ice. It stays. It grows. It cracks the stone. The men who ordered the hit, they were celebrating by now. They thought the silence was weakness. They thought they had broken Bumpy's spirit. They thought, he's shocked, he's scared, he knows he's next. What they didn't know was that Bumpy wasn't mourning. He was working. He was running the variables. He was assessing the infrastructure of his enemies. He knew that violence was a tool, but economics was a weapon. Hour 24. The silence in Harlem was deafening. The police commander called the precinct captain. "Why is it so quiet? What are they planning?" "I don't know," the captain said, "but it scares the hell out of me." Bumpy made 3 phone calls. That was it. 3 calls. He didn't call Hitman. He didn't call Muscle. He called the supply lines. He called the man who supplied the gasoline to the trucks that moved the mob's liquor. He called the man who ran the union for the dock workers where the shipments came in. He called the clerk at the city records office who handled the zoning permits for the Italians' legitimate businesses. He cut the water off. Not the literal water, the flow of money. By hour 36, the men who shot his friend weren't celebrating anymore. Their trucks were stalled. Their shipments were sitting on the docks, rotting. Their clubs were being raided by inspectors finding code violations that didn't exist yesterday. They couldn't make money, and in their world, if you aren't making money, you are dying. They called Bumpy. The phone rang in the back room of the storefront. It rang and rang. Bumpy sat there, reading a newspaper, drinking coffee. He let it ring. He let them sweat. He let them feel the walls closing in. He wanted them to understand that a bullet is quick, but poverty, irrelevance, loss of control, that is slow. That is painful. He was teaching them a lesson in physics. You push Bumpy Johnson, he doesn't push back. He removes the floor you're standing on. By hour 48, the silence was broken, not by gunfire, but by a knock on the door. A messenger from the rival faction. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he was carrying a bag, and he was carrying an apology. The bag was full of cash, reparations, blood money. The apology was a name, the name of the shooter, the specific man who pulled the trigger 9 times. They gave him up. To save their business, to save their flow, they sacrificed their own soldier. They handed him over like a peace offering on a silver platter. Bumpy looked at the messenger. He looked at the bag. He didn't touch it. "Keep the money," Bumpy said. "I don't want your money. I want the silence to end." The messenger looked confused. "The silence?" "The silence of my friend," Bumpy said. "He was a loud man. He laughed loud. He lived loud. You made him quiet. I don't like quiet." The messenger left, shaking. An hour later, the shooter, the man who thought he was a hero, the man who thought he would be promoted for taking out Bumpy's right hand, was found. He wasn't shot. He wasn't beaten. He was found sitting on a park bench, alive, with a one-way train ticket in his pocket and a look of absolute, hollow terror in his eyes. Bumpy didn't kill him. He exiled him. He stripped him of his protection, his crew, his name, and his city. He told him that if he was ever seen in Harlem again, the 9 shots would feel like a mercy. The shooter got on the train. He vanished. He became a ghost while he was still breathing. And then Bumpy went to the funeral. Thousands lined the streets. It was a state funeral for a man without a title. Flowers piled high enough to block out the sun. Bumpy walked at the front. He carried the casket. His face was a mask of stone. But as they lowered his friend into the ground, Bumpy did something he rarely did. He took off his hat. He looked up at the sky, and he smiled, a small, cold, terrifying smile. Because he knew. He knew that everyone watching, the police, the rivals, the young hustlers on the corner, they had just learned the most important lesson of their lives. They learned that you can shoot a man 9 times, you can stop his heart, you can bury his body, but you cannot kill the power of the man who loved him. Bumpy Johnson didn't fire a single shot in those 48 hours. He didn't have to. He proved that true power isn't about who has the biggest gun, it's about who controls the silence. And from that day on, when Bumpy walked into a room, the music didn't just stop because people were afraid. It stopped because they were listening. They were listening for the order. They were listening for the king. Power is patience. Violence is a reaction. Control is a strategy. The man who screams is the man who is afraid. The man who stays silent is the man who is holding the keys to the kingdom. Bumpy Johnson knew that the loudest sound in the world isn't a gunshot. It's the sound of your enemies realizing they have already lost. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.